In the quiet heart of Portland, Oregon, the evenings at St. Matthew's Medical Center usually faded into a rhythm of muted footsteps, the low hum of monitors, and the faint echo of hospital pagers bouncing off white-tiled walls. It was the kind of place where life and loss coexisted without ceremony, and among its finest surgeons was Dr. Nathan Hale, a man whose calm voice and steady hands had saved countless lives. He was 44, a trauma specialist known not only for his surgical precision but for the gentleness that seemed to follow him everywhere he went. Nurses said he had the kind of presence that made chaos feel organized, the kind of man who remembered the names of every patient he treated and never left a room without saying, "You're going to be okay." He had been at St. Matthew's for over 15 years, deeply respected, quietly admired, and always dependable. His wife, Laura Hale, a night shift nurse at the same hospital, often said Nathan's only flaw was that he never knew when to stop working. On the night of June 17, 2014, Nathan completed his final surgery just past 9 in the evening. It had been a long, difficult day, 2 trauma cases, a power fluctuation during an operation, and an emergency consult in the ICU. Still, his composure never wavered. Around 9:25 p.m., he left the operating suite, changed out of his scrubs, and walked toward his office on the 3rd floor to collect his notes and coffee mug. Security cameras later confirmed this moment. Nathan, still wearing his blue scrubs under a gray jacket, walked calmly through the corridor, holding a thermos and his hospital ID clipped to his pocket. He appeared tired but relaxed. That short hallway walk would be the last confirmed sighting of him. By 10:30 p.m., Laura realized he hadn't come by the nurse's station as he usually did before heading home. She called his phone, but it went unanswered. At first, she assumed he'd been called back into surgery or had gone to check on a patient, something he often did. But when the cleaning staff began locking up for the night and his car was still parked outside in the employee lot, unease began to spread through the hospital. By midnight, Laura and a security guard started searching the building, calling his name down empty hallways that echoed too much like memory. They checked the cafeteria, the on-call rooms, the stairwells, even the basement corridors that smelled faintly of disinfectant and rust, but there was no sign of him anywhere. At 2:15 a.m., the hospital administrator notified the police. Detectives arrived, reviewing camera footage frame by frame. The last image they saw of Nathan was him walking down the east corridor toward the staff parking exit, a hallway that had no blind spots and no other exits. Yet somehow, in that short stretch between camera zones, he vanished into the air. His car remained untouched, the keys missing, but his phone and briefcase were still in his office. There was no indication of a struggle, no forced entry, no suspicious movement caught on any of the dozen cameras in that wing. It was as though Nathan had simply stepped out of the frame and dissolved into the air. The following morning, search teams spread through the surrounding blocks, combing wooded areas near the hospital and checking riverbanks for any trace of him. Helicopters scanned overhead while volunteers handed out flyers with his photograph, a smiling man with silver-rimmed glasses, his stethoscope draped around his neck. News outlets picked up the story within hours, and by evening, the disappearance of Dr. Nathan Hale had become citywide news. For his colleagues, the hospital felt changed overnight. His absence hung in the air like an unfinished sentence, one that no one could complete. And for Laura, watching the sun rise over the parking lot where his car still sat untouched, it felt as if the world had silently erased the man she loved without leaving a single clue behind. In the weeks that followed Dr. Nathan Hale's disappearance, St. Matthew's Medical Center tried to return to its routine, but the air inside the hospital never felt the same again. Nurses walked faster through corridors they used to linger in, and the sound of closing doors or distant footsteps made night shift workers glance over their shoulders more often than they cared to admit. His office remained locked for several months, untouched except for the occasional cleaning. Inside were his medical journals, a half-empty cup of coffee, and a framed photo of him and Laura smiling on their wedding day, a reminder of a life interrupted without reason. The official search went on for months, but every lead withered. Police divers checked the nearby Willamette River, cadaver dogs searched wooded trails, and tips trickled in from across Oregon. None led anywhere. Eventually, the investigation slowed, media attention faded, and Nathan's name slipped quietly out of the headlines. For Laura, however, time stood perfectly still. Every hallway in that hospital carried an echo of him: the break room where they shared late-night coffee, the trauma bay where they once worked side by side, the quiet stairwell he used instead of the elevator. She continued her night shifts out of habit and survival, convincing herself that staying near his last known place might somehow keep her connected to him. Her coworkers tried to comfort her, but even they struggled to process the strangeness of his vanishing. One moment he was there, calm as always, charting his notes. The next he was gone, leaving behind nothing but a coat hook and an empty locker. Over the next 3 years, subtle unease lingered in the hospital like an unspoken superstition. The older staff avoided discussing what happened, while the newer employees treated the story like a cautionary rumor, something whispered in the cafeteria during late shifts, followed by awkward silence. A few night nurses reported strange occurrences near the east corridor where Nathan was last seen. They claimed to hear faint sounds, like a man's shoes tapping against tile, or the rustle of fabric brushing past. Once, a janitor swore he saw a light flicker in the sub-basement, even though no one had clearance to be down there. Maintenance dismissed it as electrical interference, but those who had been there long enough didn't believe it. The hospital continued to change. A new trauma director took Nathan's old position. Renovations expanded the emergency department, and parts of the old basement were walled off to make way for updated storage systems. Yet behind every layer of fresh paint, there was a lingering sense that something beneath it remained unresolved. Laura, though exhausted from grief, kept working at St. Matthew's, unable to leave the place that had swallowed her husband whole. She developed a quiet routine: clock in, do her rounds, visit the chapel on the second floor, and walk past the east corridor before going home. Some nights, she would pause near that hallway, staring at the security camera that had captured Nathan's last steps, whispering to herself that one day she would know the truth. On the anniversary of his disappearance each year, she left a small note taped to his old locker with a message only he would understand: still here, still waiting. It became her private ritual, unseen by others, but deeply symbolic. The hospital cleaners always found it and quietly placed it inside his office drawer, without mentioning it to anyone. People pitied her, yet they also admired her endurance. Beneath her quiet grief was a stubborn hope that never completely faded. By early 2017, the disappearance had settled into the city's collective memory as one of those tragic, unsolved cases that never finds resolution. Even the detectives who once handled the investigation had moved on to other assignments. But just when everyone thought time had buried the mystery for good, fate decided otherwise. That summer, during a maintenance inspection of the hospital's lowest level, workers stumbled upon something that would shatter 3 years of uneasy silence and reopen wounds that had barely begun to heal. It started with a complaint about a strange smell rising through the air vents, faint at first, but persistent enough that even the maintenance chief couldn't ignore it. No one imagined that this odor would lead to the rediscovery of Nathan Hale's presence in the most unexpected, hidden place within the hospital itself, a discovery that would turn quiet whispers into something far darker. It began with something small, something no one thought twice about at first. In the summer of 2017, St. Matthew's Medical Center was in the middle of minor infrastructure repairs when several night shift employees started reporting a strange metallic odor drifting through the lower floors. The smell was faint but unsettling, like rust and damp concrete mixed with something organic. For weeks, the maintenance department blamed it on old drainage pipes or forgotten supplies left behind during renovations. Yet as July turned into August, the odor grew stronger, and soon the janitorial staff refused to enter the sub-basement alone after dark. That level of the hospital hadn't been used regularly in years. It was mostly a labyrinth of locked storage rooms, old equipment, and outdated ventilation shafts that twisted behind the main structure. One evening, a maintenance supervisor named Carl Dwyer decided to trace the source of the smell himself. Armed with a flashlight and a radio, he followed the scent down to the lowest corridor where the paint peeled from the walls and the air hung heavy with humidity. The path ended at an old maintenance door that hadn't been opened in years. Rust had fused its hinges, and a cabinet had been shoved against it as if someone wanted it kept shut. After calling for backup, Carl and another worker forced the door open, and as it creaked outward, a gust of stale, suffocating air rushed past them. Dust motes floated in the beam of his flashlight as he stepped into a narrow utility chamber, its walls lined with aging pipes and broken valves. Everything inside looked forgotten, except for what hung quietly on a metal hook at the far end of the room. It was a white doctor's coat, its fabric stiff with age and streaked with brown stains that looked like dried blood. The hospital logo still clung faintly to the chest pocket, and though the color had faded, the stitched name remained visible: Dr. Nathan Hale. Beneath it lay a pair of surgical scrubs, a shattered wristwatch, and a clipboard with warped paper stuck to it by moisture. Carl froze, his throat tightening as he whispered to his coworker to call security. Within minutes, the sub-basement was sealed off and the police were notified. When investigators arrived, they treated the scene like a crime scene from the past resurrected. The coat was carefully removed and sealed in an evidence bag, while photographs documented every inch of the small chamber. The smell that had alarmed staff for weeks came from a damp area near a corroded drain, but no remains were found. Still, the meticulous way the coat was hung struck everyone as strange. The hook was positioned neatly, as if whoever placed it there wanted it to be seen, not hidden. There were no signs of forced entry, no blood trail leading elsewhere, just that one haunting relic hanging under the flickering light. When Laura Hale received the call that something belonging to her husband had been found, she drove to the hospital in silence, her hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. The moment she saw the evidence bag containing his coat, she collapsed into tears. To her, it wasn't just a piece of fabric, it was a fragment of a life frozen in time, a cruel reminder that he had been closer than anyone imagined, somewhere beneath their feet all along. The discovery ignited media attention almost immediately. Reporters crowded outside the hospital gates, speculating wildly about whether a body would soon be found or if foul play had been involved. The Portland police reopened Nathan Hale's missing person case, bringing in forensic teams to sweep the sub-basement for DNA traces, fingerprints, or signs of tampering. Technicians took samples from the stains on the coat, while cadaver dogs searched the tunnels leading off from the room. What puzzled everyone most was how the area had been sealed off at all. According to hospital records, the maintenance room had been decommissioned in 2009, 5 years before Nathan vanished. No one could explain why it was blocked by cabinets or who would have had access to that section of the basement. For Laura, the revelation brought no comfort. It only deepened her torment. If the coat was found down there, then Nathan had been somewhere in that maze of corridors, maybe trapped, maybe hidden, maybe silenced. She couldn't shake the thought that someone inside the hospital knew more than they ever admitted. As police tape cordoned off the sub-basement and investigators carried evidence upstairs, the building that once symbolized healing now felt infected by something darker. The discovery wasn't closure. It was the beginning of a new chapter and a far more haunting one. One that would unravel secrets buried beneath years of silence. The discovery of Dr. Nathan Hale's blood-stained coat in the hospital's sub-basement turned what had long been considered a cold case into the center of a quiet storm. The Portland Police Department, under growing media pressure, reopened the investigation within days. Detectives, forensic specialists, and hospital administrators gathered in conference rooms to review every scrap of evidence collected in 2014. Boxes of old reports were reopened, logs re-examined, and statements once dismissed as routine were suddenly under a microscope. For the first time in 3 years, the name Dr. Nathan Hale echoed through police radio again, but now it carried suspicion rather than confusion. The new team assigned to the case began with a full structural assessment of St. Matthew's Medical Center. Blueprints from the 1970s revealed something disturbing. The sub-basement where the coat was found wasn't supposed to exist in its current form. Decades of renovations had altered the original layout, sealing off tunnels and supply shafts that once connected various departments. Some of these passageways had been blocked during hospital upgrades, but others were simply forgotten. A narrow maintenance corridor directly beneath the east wing, the same direction Nathan had been walking the night he vanished, showed no official record of being closed. Investigators decided to explore it, hoping to find answers in the forgotten architecture. The search team descended into the basement in protective gear, guided by an engineer familiar with the hospital's old design. They followed the concrete hallway until it ended abruptly behind a wall of crumbled plaster and pipes. It took nearly 4 hours of careful excavation before they uncovered what looked like the edge of a rusted metal door. When they finally pried it open, the space beyond was pitch dark, filled with stale air and layers of dust that suggested no one had entered for years. Inside were remnants of old hospital equipment, an oxygen tank, broken gurneys, scattered paperwork fused together by moisture, and, buried partially under debris, the twisted remains of a small rolling cart. On it lay a few surgical instruments, coated in grime, and something that made everyone fall silent. A cracked pair of glasses, identical to the ones Nathan Hale was wearing the night he disappeared. The items were carefully collected and sent to the state crime lab for analysis. Within a week, the lab confirmed that fingerprints found on the instruments matched Nathan's. The discovery stunned investigators. The space appeared to be an unused storage area that had partially collapsed sometime around 2014, most likely during a maintenance project in that section. Structural engineers suggested that if Nathan had somehow entered that corridor, perhaps checking on an alarm or inspecting equipment as he sometimes did, he could have been caught in the collapse and trapped without a way out. The corroded pipes and lack of ventilation made it entirely possible that he lost consciousness quickly. To the police, the most logical conclusion was that his death was an accident, a tragic case of misfortune and timing. Yet something about the scene bothered Detective Clara Mason, the lead investigator. There was no evidence of a body, and more curiously, the doctor's coat that had been found earlier was far too clean to have survived a collapse. It looked placed, hung neatly, carefully, deliberately. If Nathan had been trapped there, who had taken his coat and displayed it years later? The room where it was found had been sealed off with cabinets that required considerable effort to move. It wasn't the kind of space a random worker would choose to hide something in. Someone who knew the hospital intimately had done it. Clara began re-examining the hospital's internal records and discovered something unsettling buried in the administrative archives. In the months leading up to Nathan's disappearance, St. Matthew's was under quiet investigation for irregularities in its procurement accounts. Large purchases of anesthetics, organ preservation solutions, and high-grade medical instruments were recorded but never used in surgeries. Nathan, according to his colleagues, had voiced concerns about missing inventory and questioned why supplies were being redirected under an off-site partnership program. He had even written an internal report warning of potential ethical violations, though it was never made public. When Clara cross-checked these records, a pattern emerged. The supply orders had been signed off by Dr. Malcolm Renner, the hospital's chief of administration at the time, who resigned abruptly a few months after Nathan disappeared, citing personal reasons. Renner had since moved to Arizona and was working in private consulting. Clara reached out to him for questioning, but his responses were vague. He claimed no memory of the reports and brushed off the procurement issues as standard logistical mistakes. Still, his tone was nervous and his answers didn't sit right. Meanwhile, forensic teams continued to study the sub-basement materials. Trace chemical analysis revealed small residues of desflurane and rocuronium, specialized anesthetics not commonly used outside high-level surgeries. The same substances had been flagged in those irregular supply orders Nathan had questioned. To Clara, it seemed increasingly likely that Nathan had stumbled upon something much bigger than a clerical error. She began to suspect that St. Matthew's had been quietly involved in unethical organ transplant activity under the guise of research partnerships. If Nathan had discovered the truth, someone might have wanted him silenced. But without a body or direct evidence of foul play, the case sat in a murky gray zone between tragedy and conspiracy. Laura Hale, however, had no doubt in her heart. She believed her husband had been silenced for something he uncovered. Late one evening, Clara met her outside the hospital after another long day of reviewing documents. Laura spoke softly, her voice drained but steady. She said, "Nathan never just disappeared. He was taken from here, and someone wanted it to look like he wasn't." Those words stayed with Clara as she drove home that night, staring at the hospital's glowing windows in her rear-view mirror. By the end of that year, the department quietly concluded its inquiry with the statement that Dr. Nathan Hale's death was most consistent with accidental entrapment. Officially, the case was closed again. Yet within St. Matthew's, whispers continued. Staff who had worked there long enough believed the hospital's basement was more than storage, a place where old secrets were buried, and one man's integrity had cost him his life. Though no one could prove what really happened, the sense of something unfinished clung to every hallway, and every time a light flickered in the east corridor, nurses felt the same chill, as if Nathan's presence was still there, reminding them that truth, no matter how deeply hidden, never stays buried forever. In the months that followed, the hospital became a war zone of whispers. News crews hovered outside the gates. Families of former patients demanded answers, and investigators swarmed every floor of the building, peeling back layers of secrets that had been buried for years. Charlotte, now gaunt and sleepless, spent her nights reviewing the last files her husband had worked on, searching for something, anything that might connect his disappearance to what they had found in that sub-basement. And then, one evening, she noticed something strange in the archives. A hidden set of medical records, unsigned but linked to her husband's access ID. They belonged to patients who were never officially admitted, people who seemed to vanish off the books after surgery. The dates matched the months leading up to Simon's disappearance. It became clear that he had stumbled onto something terrible, something big enough to silence him. Detectives soon uncovered what that something was. Behind the hospital's legitimate research funding, a shadow operation had been siphoning organs for private buyers. A handful of senior staff, including the now retired hospital administrator, were in on it, using the sub-basement as their surgical hub. When Simon discovered their secret and threatened to expose them, they made sure he would never make it to Chicago. His car, it turned out, had been found days later on an abandoned service road near the old hospital incinerator. But it had been logged under another case file, an administrative error that now looked very deliberate. The dress uniform Charlotte had found had been his backup scrubs from that night, still soaked in a preservative meant to disguise human fluids. Forensic tests confirmed the traces of Simon's DNA, but also revealed something else. A second profile belonging to Dr. Evelyn Reed, the head of the hospital's transplant committee, who had vanished herself months before the discovery. In the final confrontation, agents raided Evelyn's rural property outside the city, where they found an underground surgical chamber lined with stainless tables and blood-stained tarps. Among the debris lay Simon's old pager, fused from heat and time, and a burned photo of him and Charlotte from their medical school days. It was the last physical piece connecting them. Though Evelyn had disappeared across the border, her confession, recorded on a corrupted hard drive recovered from the site, outlined everything. She admitted that Simon had refused to cooperate with their trafficking network and had tried to save one of the victims. In the chaos that followed, he was struck during an altercation and left in the sub-basement, the scene staged to look like a breakdown. His body had been hidden within a maintenance shaft, sealed by concrete months later during renovations. When rescue teams finally broke through that wall, they found a single skeletonized hand clutching a surgical pen engraved with the initials S.A. Charlotte stood there when they pulled it out, tears streaming down her face, not of shock, but of release. For 3 years, she had lived between denial and torment, haunted by possibilities worse than death. Now she had truth, bitter and incomplete, but truth nonetheless. The hospital was shut down within weeks, its name scrubbed from signage and memory. Charlotte left medicine altogether and joined a national task force against medical exploitation, using her husband's story as a warning